course after Princeton Links. Princeton Links really focuses on the mathematics of medical imaging and linear systems. And so it's very explicit in its mathematical derivations. This one is more, picture oriented, right? So it's a good alternative. So again, after we're finished this course, you should really understand computed tomography, really understand MRI. You should also understand quantitative methods for evaluating the success or failure of your imaging method, right? And so it truly depends on the task at hand. And so if you're trying to detect a very small tumor in somebody's brain, that is a different task, for example, than detecting ventricular function of their heart. A very small tumor in their brain just sits there quietly. It doesn't move. It sits there. It could be small. It could have different tissue properties than the surrounding tissue. And so you don't really care about snapping a quick picture of that thing. You can take hours to get a good picture of that thing. But if you're looking at somebody's heart and how it responds, say, to stress, when you give them a drug or you make them go on a bicycle or something and you want to see what happens to the heart physically and dynamically, then you have a whole other imaging problem on your hands. You have to take quick pictures that watch the motion of that object. So there's trade-offs involved to all that. And the trade-offs are signal to noise, temporal resolution, spatial resolution, things like that. And so those are the quantities that we'll figure out how to compute, how to measure when you have an imaging device. How do I measure the spatial resolution of that device, etc. You're all, now everybody in the room has a miraculous camera. Miraculous to me because I'm 62, right? So when I was born, if you told me I'd have a 12 megapixel camera in my hand, I would have said, what's a megapixel, right? So when I was a kid, so now you've got this ridiculous camera just at your side. But, when you take pictures, you see there's artifacts in those pictures, right? You see that, like, if there's a motion artifact with blur, if you pan across it, there's artifacts because people move during the pan and all of this kind of stuff. You just get used to that. All of that is, image processing in your brain as to, did I capture the light at the right moment, right? So, we use like high resolution imaging equipment, but it doesn't approach a 12 megapixel camera in your pocket, right? So as you'll see, these images that we look at have things like a big one is 512 by 512 pixels. And then if it's 3D, it might have 256 slices. That's a big medical image, right? If you get to 1024 by 1024 by 1024, that's an enormous medical image. That's a big, big medical image. And so, interestingly enough, what we thought was big data isn't really big data anymore. It's like medium data or manageable data. And now I would encourage you all to go to the NASA website and download the high resolution pictures coming back from web and stuff. Just put them in MATLAB and start noodling around. Those are big pictures. Like they're panels of things in a massive field of view, right? So we'll look also at applications. How do you use CT and how do you use MR? And there's a myriad of applications for those things. And ideally, at the end of it, if somebody came up to you and said, hey, I want to image this thing in somebody's body. I want to image the perfusion of their femoral head in their hip, right? That's a great question. Some physician goes, I wish I knew the perfusion in this hip. You should be able to say, oh, I can do that. I'll tell you how to do that. You take an MR scan. When we inject this contrast, we'll measure the dynamics of the flow and stuff like that, right? So ideally, that's where we'll be at by the end. So the basic structure of this, how you set it up from both an engineering standpoint and a math standpoint, is you have an object, which is the sort of given truth, the underlying object itself, and your imaging device takes some signal from that object, with the camera, it's the reflected light. With MRI, it's radio waves. With CT, it's the transmission of X-rays through the object. And so you have some imaging device that collects signal from this object, right? And then we take all that signal and pile it into some organized data set, right? And in MRI, it's usually piled into the Fourier transform of the object. In CT, as we'll see, it's a set of projections of X-ray beams through the object. And so now I've got this measured data, or the raw data. And it can take an hour to get the raw data, or it can take 100 milliseconds or 10 milliseconds to get the raw data. It depends on what you're doing, right? And so now I have this raw data. It looks nothing like the object, usually, the raw data that you collect. So you stick that raw data into a computer and you manipulate it to produce a reasonable facsimile of the object, or what you believe the object is based on that data, right? So this is the whole imaging chain, right? And this reconstruction, you can imagine now, because you all use deep learning, right, for voice recognition on your phone, or when you have iPhotos or whatever, it recognizes people, like their face, and puts them in boxes and stuff like that. Remarkably, through all ages, I have pictures of my eldest child is like 33, and I've pictures of her as an infant, and it nails it. Gets, you're like, how do you do that? That's kind of spooky. But anyway, deep learning is going to probably take over this loop right here, right? In the sense that if you have 10,000 examples or 100,000 examples of turning raw data into the object, you could probably teach a network how to do it fastest and best, right? And so that's a huge sort of shift in radiology right now, is deep learning reconstruction from raw data. It hasn't projected back into this saying, oh, now I can change my imaging device because I know I have this different reconstruction technique, so I don't need data that's as good as I used to, right? You can imagine how that's going to go, right? If you get raw data from really expensive devices, produce fantastic pictures. Teach the learning algorithm how to deal with data that's a little screwed up, and then have a cheap device that gives you screwed up data, but you still get a good picture, right? So this whole loop is going to sort of close in that end. So we'll look quickly at the history of this. So Röntgen discovered X-rays in 1895, so not that long ago, 125 years ago or something like that. And within 2 years of discovering X-rays, the first papers were published about using X-rays to take medical images. Okay, so it happened really fast, right? And then they created X-ray machines on the back of wagons that in World War I that they would take out to the field, and X-ray soldiers who got hit with shrapnel and stuff like that, and to see what was going on. So it was the first portable X-ray unit, right? And so, this is a big discovery, Nobel Prizes, but unfortunately everybody died of cancer because they didn't know what X-rays were, and they were like taking pictures of their hands and all this kind of stuff. Bloch and Purcell right after the war, World War II, my generation would call it the war, but anyway, they discovered nuclear magnetic resonance, which is the interaction of radio frequency energy with the nucleus of an atom. And so it turns out that if you put an atom in a magnetic field, certain nuclei have a characteristic called spin. There's no really good classical analogy for spin other than angular momentum, because it kind of behaves like an angular momentum, but I've never seen a good sort of matching of quantum mechanics and classical description. But anyway, with spin, when it's in a magnetic field, you can get 2 energy levels of that nucleus in that magnetic field. And the difference between those 2 energy levels turns out to be photons in the radio frequency range for most magnetic fields, right? And so this is an incredible discovery. They won the Nobel Prize together for just discovering nuclear magnetic resonance. Not too later, basically Paul Lauterbur took nuclear magnetic resonance and figured out how to take pictures with that signal. In 1972, Gregory Hounsfield invented independently, really, the CT scanner at EMI in England, and then rapidly after that, they started being produced for whole body. So this is a picture, one of the first X-ray pictures, right? This is of Runken's wife's hand, right? And that's a ring on her hand, absorbing X-rays more than the rest of her hand. The way we do this now is you have an X-ray source that's as small as possible, so it's like a point source. If it could be a point source, you would make it a point source, but you can't generate X-rays because it takes energy from a point, because you'd have a heck of a hot point, right? So it's usually a little rectangle, and it shoots the X-rays out like an X-ray light bulb. And you put a patient, here with respect to the X-ray light bulb, and you shine it through the patient, and it casts a shadow on a detector, right? And where there is a lot of tissue that absorbs the X-rays, you get a shadow, right? And that's, I think we just ran out of battery. Let me see if there's another microphone. Or I just might have to yell. Okay, I'll be right back. I think we're back here. All right. Back on track. So that's the fundamentals of how X-rays are used. Here we are at sort of the turn of the century, where you had an X-ray source, this high voltage, gizmo over here is going to create the X-rays. We'll look at that a bit. And then the patient held a film screen, like a phosphorescent screen with film on the back of it. So the X-rays, when they hit the phosphor, they would make a flash, and then you would expose the film, and then you look at the film. As time went on, people got more sophisticated about making X-ray machines. This is one of my favorites, where you have an X-ray source down here, and you insert your foot in here with your shoes. You're at the shoe store, right? And you put the shoe on, and you insert your foot here, and then your shoe salesman turns on the X-ray machine, and you look down at your foot, right? Just take a look and wiggle your toes, and you see your toes going. Terrific machine. They don't make them anymore. And for good reason, right? Because everybody here is getting inundated with X-rays, including this poor shoe salesman, right? He's there every day, isn't it? So Lord knows how that worked out. But so in the modern hospital, we have a patient here. Everything's basically the same. You have a detector behind this patient, an X-ray source right here that's like a big X-ray light bulb. It's going to shine X-rays, and they project through this patient and make a picture. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, when you say everything's the same, you don't mean like they were still bombarding them with like huge amounts of radiation, right? Like,
depends.
We reached a point where we realized that we could lower the dosage, but
yes,
still resolve good images.
Yeah, but I tell you what, one of the biggest technological advances in X-ray imaging is making bigger and brighter X-ray sources, right? So now you can buy X-ray tubes that are 100 times more powerful than they were just 15 years ago. And the reason is you would like to have a very fast flash of X-rays in some applications. And so now you got these massive X-ray tubes that create huge amounts of X-rays, but you have them on for a very short time, right? Yeah, exactly. And now there's very sophisticated methods of calculating what is the dose that this patient will receive for this application. And so that's a big field of X-ray imaging, is doing, say, a big Monte Carlo simulation of photons going through a patient and calculating how many get absorbed and what is the absorbed dose by that patient. right? And that's a significant issue with X-ray imaging. Is like you can't just do it over and over again. You have to balance the advantage of knowing what's going on inside that patient with the amount of radiation exposure that you have. Okay? And that's a whole field in X-ray imaging, people computing that. This guy is going to drink this milkshake. It's like got barium in it. You can put some kind of flavor to make it better, but you drink it down, it's this really thick stuff that goes down your esophagus. And as it's moving down his esophagus, you'll take pictures, poof, 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 and watch the swallowing motion, right? And see if there is a lesion in the esophagus is one thing you could look for, or just look at the mechanics of the swallowing, right? If there's a problem with that. So that's just, but basically it's kind of the same, technology there. So here's this is like 100 or even less, sort of a 10th of a millisecond flash or 100th of a millisecond flash of X-ray, poof, with a patient in front of the film screen. And you can see, obviously, the great thing about radiology and human beings is that humans, for the most part, are symmetric around this central axis, right? Except for the heart and a couple other things. But that symmetry is really great, because if you're a radiologist, you look at this side and look at this side. If they're different, we got an issue, right? So a lot of times you're your own control. You look on the right side of your brain, you look on the left side of your brain. If it's all different, then you've got a problem. So this cloud here is pneumonia. So if you have a persistent cough and you're like, oh my God, you just go get a chest X-ray, it costs $30 or something, and then you can tell whether or not you've got fluid on your lungs, right? In the news over the last, 3 years, this is a special type of pneumonia created by COVID, right? A COVID infection. So this is a patient before they had COVID. This is upon admittance to the hospital when they came in and they were diagnosed with COVID. And so you can see these little things here called ground glass lesions, because they look kind of spiculated. And you can see there's just a higher density of fluid in the lung. And this is after 10 days in the hospital, right? And so it's just, it's getting worse. The CT scans of this fluid are also very impressive, like in terms of, like, that's when COVID first came and the first CT images came out, I was like, oh, not fooling around with this. Just like, I don't want to go in there. It's bad. So here's another use of projection X-rays, and this is a mammogram. And what you're looking for here is high density tissue, right? That is the beginnings of breast cancer, right? And they have particular physical attributes in terms of the spiculations of the signal itself. But you can see there's a lot of interfering signal here. This is a projection through a whole breast that is compressed. And then you shine the X-rays through the breast and you have a very high resolution detector, right? And depending who you listen to, women should start getting scanned for breast cancer sort of in their 40s. It depends who your physician is. It's kind of, and then this is taken with a 3-dimensional breast imaging machine called breast tomosynthesis. And so you can cut out a lot of overlaying tissue and just isolate this signal right here, right? You can see here, it's kind of, there's a lot of interference with the tissue over and above. And so here it's isolated better. And so this has higher sensitivity for detecting, lesions. This form of X-ray imaging is done a lot. It is not, let's say it's not the favorite imaging of many radiologists, because these are very hard to read. You have to read thousands and thousands to get good at this. And it's a very low reimbursement, which is one of the things in the US medical system, which is an issue. It's like they're not paid salary, you get reimbursed per case kind of thing. So you have to read tens of thousands of these things to get paid anything. So primary target for deep learning, right? So because now if you digitize millions of mammography scans and you have the outcome, because these mammography scans come from sometime, say 1991, and you know what happened in 1996, you know the outcome of this thing for certain, so you have the truth data. So you can train these networks to go in and say, this thing really does look serious. I've sat for a week with radiologists who read these things. It is a tough job, right? Because they're on the fence a lot. They're just, oh, I don't know. You don't want to have a false positive, because if the person goes and has a biopsy, and everybody's scared. So here is another form of projection X-ray imaging in which, you have basically this fairly uniform field except for the ribs. These are ribs. This background here is lung. And what we're going to see is this is a catheter, plastic catheter that was inserted basically into the femoral artery of a patient in their leg. Okay, so they're lying on a table and you cut a little hole in their femoral artery and you push this catheter in there and you just keep pushing. And it goes up their aorta, over their aortic arch, and it comes down to the heart, right above the heart, and then you plug that catheter into their coronary artery. You have two coronary arteries that feed the heart blood. You plug it in there, and then you inject a dye, right? And the dye has a lot of iodine in it, and so it is a great X-ray attenuator. And you can see this beautiful projection of these vessels now because they're filling up with this dye. This is done millions of times a year in the United States, and it's done to diagnose coronary artery disease and whether or not a person has a lesion in their coronary artery that deserves attention. Should you go in there and open that artery with a stent, right? Or should you put this person on a very aggressive drug regime to try and bring their blood pressure down, all their other risk factors, so they don't have a heart attack? Transformational technology was invented by radiologists. Now it's done by cardiologists. Every cardiology department in the world has many of these labs that people get this done in. So it's used for diagnostic purposes, but it's also used to direct the therapy. When you place the stent, you need an image like this to place the stent. So you can see each one of these pictures. Okay, I can't take 10 seconds to take each one, right? I need to get each picture like a 30th of a second, or maybe a 100th of a second, and then put them together as a clear movie. And the reason why this movie looks so clear is this movie is comprises, say, 30 frames. Each one is only a few microsecond flash. It's like poof, 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 right? So each flash gives a very sharp picture, right? When we decide how many X-rays do we use per flash, I get a much better picture if I use more X-rays. So there's a balance there. So you sort of turn the dial up and down to deciding how much dose do I give this patient. If the patient is 68 and their EKG is all over the map and they have really hard chest pain and things are going, X-ray dose is not your major problem at that point in your life, right? You are on the precipice of dying. So basically, you just don't worry about it too much at that point. So there's a balance, right? Computed tomography started mathematically a long time ago, it's 100 years ago, where the radon transform was invented. And the radon transform states that if I have a function, let's say I have a function z of x and y. So it's just like let's just say it's a big, cake sitting here. Z is a function of x and y. If I take projections of that function, right? So I integrate that function along lines through the function at many different angles. If I do that at enough different angles, I can reconstruct that function. I can tell you what the function is just from the projections, right? So that's the fundamental theorem. Now, before radon came along, people thought you should be able to do that, but did not know. So it was proven. Independently, this guy, Alan Cormack, basically in the context of doing computed tomography imaging with X-rays, because we have projections with X-rays, basically. So he thought, well, got these projections. Should I be able to take multiple projections and recreate something in 3D? He didn't even know about radon, and he figured it out, right, from CT. And Godfrey Hounsfield, independent of both these guys, nobody read any papers, right? They just went ahead to the lab and kept going. Actually built experimental CT scanner in his lab at EMI. He was a research engineer at EMI, and they had tons of money back when he did this because they had just been flush with cash because EMI owned Capitol Records, and Capitol Records had signed the Beatles like years before, so it was like one of the richest record companies in the world. So they had all this money to spend on crazy ideas, and he built the first CT scanner, which was pretty primitive. But he won the Nobel Prize for building that little desktop CT scanner. So CT, the basic principle by which it works is you have an X-ray beam coming this way from the up here. Let's say I have a source up here, right? And then the beams come down and they hit. This object is a circle. Let's say it's water, and inside here we have bone or something in these circles. As I go through this one, a lot of the X-rays get absorbed, and so my counts that I actually measure go down because they got absorbed by this object. So that produces this function, which is like a projection. And then if I back project it, if I take that function and just like map it back onto that space, then I know in one dimension, hey, I've got an object somewhere up and down here that's absorbing a lot of X-rays. I don't know where it is up and down here, but I sure know it's up and down here somewhere. It's not over here, right? So let's take another view of that same object, but we'll move the X-ray source over to here, and we'll take a side view, right? Same object, but now the projection looks quite different because we're obviously projecting from a different angle. And if I back project that signal, well, now I can tell you, well, my bright object's probably somewhere in this area, right? And that's just with two projections. But it works here because I only have two objects, right? So it's a pretty simple reconstruction problem. Things aren't interfering with each other in these projections. So with two, I get a pretty good picture, right, for this simple object. As you can imagine, if you want a picture that has every pixel or every point nicely mapped, we need a lot of projections, right? And that's CT. That's how that works. The way to do it is you take your X-ray source and you either raster it across. If your object's here, raster it across, or take a single source, have a fan beam of X-rays that hit a detector, and so you get all of them simultaneously in this fan beam. And then even better, you can have a two-dimensional detector, right? And have a source, and then the object's here, and it projects a 2D picture of basically absorption of the X-rays. And you can do that at multiple angles, and now you get all of these pictures. Right? Classically, this dimension here is about anywhere from 64 to 256 in this direction, and about 1,000 in this direction, right? So remember, back to your phone, that's a tiny, tiny little detector, right? In those dimensions, but it's an X-ray camera, so so the way it's set up usually is the detector's over here, the source is over here. You put the patient in a tube, and then you spin this thing around to take different views, right? And the faster you can spin this thing around, the faster you can get those views. Hence, why we need very powerful X-ray sources, like that shoot a lot of X-rays, because if this thing starts going really fast, we need all the X-rays really quickly. If this thing takes 2 seconds to get around the patient, then you can ramp down the X-rays per unit time because you're going to take 2 seconds to get all that done. Here's just a picture of what a modern scanner looks like. The table can move back and forth while you're scanning with high precision. One thing you can do is if your detector has a finite width and you want to scan an entire person, is you just start the CT scanner spinning and keep collecting data as you move the patient through the scanner. And so now you have kind of a spiral of data that you can use to reconstruct that whole section of the patient. This is what actual data looks like. This is 256 detectors in this direction. This is up from the scanner we have in the Thornton Hospital here, and we use MATLAB to hack the raw data out of their raw data file, and this is what the projections look like, right? And so this is projections of a heart. This is the dome of the liver right here. You can see the profile of the heart is about here. That's the spine right there. Sorry, it's so jittery, but you can kind of see the detail and the change in angle for each projection. And this is an interesting point. See how it gets really noisy here? See how it gets hashy? What happens there is you're projecting through a very thick direction. So you're going from the right or the left arm all the way through to the right arm, so all the way through the long part of the patient. And what happens is so many x-rays get absorbed that you start getting uncertainty in how many, like you're down to a few x-rays hitting your detector. And so that gets to be a noisy estimate. That's why it looks noisy. So in 1975, one of the first clinical CT scanners, like Siemens built one of the first ones. And as you'll see, medical imaging companies are like big iron companies. There's Siemens, General Electric, used to be Toshiba, now Canon, but these big companies, right? Because it's like kind of like making a jet engine or something, as opposed to making, a washing machine or a computer, right? Sort of a combination of a really good washing machine and a computer. But so the mechanics of these machines and the signals and everything are fairly sophisticated. But anyway, Siemens got into the game early, so did GE. 128 by 128 image. This thing would have taken half an hour to collect and about an hour to reconstruct back in 1975. Right? Now, modern CT scanner, 512 by 512, collected in 250 milliseconds and reconstructed in about a second, something like that. Right? So now the data just, there's so many pictures, right? That's an issue. It's like, how do you look at all these pictures? I have 10,000 pictures of one patient. How do you present that in a natural way such that a radiologist can look at it and just make a call, right? Here's some just example pictures from CT scans. This is a coronal plane of a person. There's their kidney, liver, stuff like that. Here's a sagittal plane of somebody's head, right, with the skull, spine, brain up here. You can just look at the bones in 3D. You can look at blood perfusion, like how much, if you inject a contrast agent, you ask the question, how much of that contrast agent got here at this time, right? And if there's a big imbalance on one side of the brain, that's indicative of somebody having a stroke, for instance. So that's done a lot when people come in and they have some kind of paralysis or something. You just put them in, do this picture really quickly and decide, is this patient stroking? What should we do now? Should we try and reperfuse it, etc.? So CT is great for the emergency room. One of the reasons why it's great for the emergency room is a lot of patients, when they come into the emergency room, they have a line in, they have an oxygen bottle, they have all of this gear on the gurney when they arrive. And if you take all that into an MR unit, that's a problem. If something gets left with the patient, like the oxygen bottle, it'll fly off at a ridiculous speed. So because it's in a magnetic field. CT, you don't worry about that because no magnetic field, but you just have to step away while you take the picture so you don't get x-rayed. And so this is a young woman. She came in with like severe chest pain. And then from the CT, from the 3D CT, or from a good radiologist would just look through these slices. And there's this signal right here down the middle of her aorta. And that's part of the aortic wall has basically come away from the aortic wall and is now a piece of tissue that's going straight down the middle of the aorta. That's called an aortic dissection. And it's an emergent thing. You want to know that it's there right now. You don't care about dose right now. You just want to know where it is, how bad it is. Do we need to put a big stent in there to save this person's life? And so it's great. And then here's just some of the settings for those scans. The whole scan time from here to here, the whole scan time is under a second, right? So the patient, the table moves through really fast. Here's the amount of X-rays per unit time is given in this unit here, which is milliamp seconds, which is like when you turn up your X-ray intensity, that's what the dial says. And the energy of those X-rays go up to 90 kilovolt peak. That's what the thing is set to, but we'll look at all of these things later. Computed tomography has become, from this is 95 to 2007, look at the fractional increase of number of scans done when patients come into the ER. It's a technology that just took over radiology, because simply, if you want to know what's going on, you should take a look, right? That's it. You should, as opposed to standing there going, I don't know why your belly hurts. No, and then once you've done it, right? And you know how things go. So it's a terrific technology. Here's a CT scan of a heart. This is one coronary artery coming down here, the left. This is the circ, and then the right coronary artery here. This image was taken in a single heartbeat, like 140 milliseconds, something like that. So you can get fantastic pictures of coronary arteries. I would recommend that you go to these sites, Siemens, Toshiba. I guess this is Canon now. They got bought. GE Healthcare, and just type in and Google GE CT scanners, and just take a look at some of the pictures and some of the technology. It's amazing stuff. It's really great. We have to finish in 2 minutes, right? Oh, wow. Oh, 12:20? Nice. Okay. I was going to say, I can't get through 20 slides in 2 minutes, but I was going to try. Thanks. So MRI, here's those two clowns again who invented MR, or discovered MR. They didn't invent it. They discovered it. It's, just basic physics. It was great stuff. And then this guy who looks so happy is Paul Lauterbur. And he, in his NMR spectrometer, figured out how to turn on these spatial gradients to change the field as a function of position in the spectrometer in a pre-planned way, such that he could tell you where two test tubes were relative to each other in the spectrometer, right? And it turns out these NMR spectrometers, which they give you these radio frequency signals at slightly different frequencies depending on the chemical element. And so they're very useful for chemistry. But they also have magnetic field gradients. And the reason you have field gradients, the ability to adjust the field as a function of position, is when you try and build one, you can never build it such that you get a perfectly homogeneous field, which is what you want. So you build in these gradients such that you can adjust them to make the field perfectly homogeneous. So from one side to the other of your sample, the field is exactly the same. So you can integrate up all that signal, right? Well, perhaps Paul Lauterbur was really bad at adjusting his shims and he couldn't get it. So, and he noticed he got so bad at it that there was this huge magnetic field gradient across the sample. And he could see, hey, wait a minute, I've got a projection of my sample, right? Because the frequency on this side is different than this side. This is all a apocryphal story that I just made up. Okay. But anyway, he's like, if you crank on those field gradients, that's what's happening. You start distributing signal based on its location in space. And then he published a paper in 72 or 73 where he just had two blobs and said, this is test tube 1, test tube 2. And that was really the birth of MRI. And then didn't take long for people to scale it up to human size. These are physics labs in both Nottingham and Aberdeen, where in physics departments, they built these whole body scanners. They had to make a magnet that was big enough, and then a gradient system and all this kind of stuff. And it looked like something that was, pretty tough, right? And actually my advisor for my PhD, who got into MR pretty early, said when he first looked at MR, he decided it wasn't going to go anywhere because you would need a superconducting magnet the size of a small truck, and the whole thing would cost about $2 million. So he said, that's not going to go anywhere. Of course, that's exactly what it was. And then you can buy them off the shelf right now. So here's a really big, this is a really big MR scanner. So the magnetic field is produced by these superconducting coils, and it's a very high field. It's sort of 10,000 times the Earth's field, or 100,000. What is it now? 100,000 times the Earth's field. But this is why you have to be careful, because if you have like a wrench right here, just in your hand, right? And you're standing right here, you have a wrench in your hand, that's impossible. It is not going to be in your hand. It will be gone. Nobody can hold on to it. It just like the magnet is so strong that any kind of ferromagnetic metal just flies in there with ridiculous force. Anyway, if you keep all that stuff out of the room, you put the patient in this magnetic field, and then you can use the machine to take pictures of arbitrary planes, volumes. There is literally tens, like probably 10 to 100 different independent contrast mechanisms you can think of with this machine. It's absolutely spectacular. And it was developed primarily in the 80s was all the technology, and a lot of it was developed in universities, interestingly. And what happened was the universities would buy a system from General Electric or Siemens or someone, and then with the company, the physicists in the department would reprogram the darn machine, right? And these companies would fly you to their home base and give you a 1-week course on how to program the machine. It was wonderful, right? That never happened in CT. CT is a closed shop, right? It's very secretive. And in MR, if you go to the big NMR meeting, there's like 6,000 people at the meeting. And all of these people have made careers out of creating new imaging technology. If you go to the meeting for CT, there's 250 people. They are the 250 people in the world who really know how to do CT, and half of them work for industry, right? It's like night and day, the two cultures. It's very, very interesting. And I spent my young career in MRI, which was a good decision. It's a great place to be because it was so inclusive. And my older career in CT, and it's a good thing I'm old and crusty because I don't really give a damn. But I think as a young person, MR is a better environment, to be perfectly honest. But we have these spectacular systems. Like here's one that's at 3 Tesla. They all started out commercially about 0.3 or 0.15. And then GE introduced this 1.5 Tesla machine, which everybody thought would be terrible. Turned out to be great. And then it went to 3T over the last 20 years. And then there's 7T systems, 9.4T systems. And these are very, very rare. They're in the dozens, if that. Like 7T is more common now, but because you just get more signal, right? So the higher the field goes, the stronger the signal comes back from the patient. So that's the primary reason to do it. And you look at the pictures, they're just spectacular, right? So you get all these different contrast weightings depending on the tissue. Yeah.
Having such high Tesla MRIs, don't you call it tissue damage?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So the question is, what is the point of having this crazy thing that costs $10 million, like it's 11.7 Tesla machine? Two things happen. One is that just the signal kind of goes up roughly linear with field strength. So you get, a lot more signal here. And so you can image things that are smaller. So the spatial resolution of your picture can get better and better and better, right? Also, at that field strength, chemically, the frequency that different chemicals resonate at gets farther apart. So you can actually do better resolution of things chemically by where they're resonating. And also there's another thing, and you'll get into this a lot with Dr. Liu, but they're called relaxation times. And the relaxation times change with field strength. So it changes your contrast properties. Right? So, and it's just big, right? I mean, if you're there and go, I've got a 3T magnet. Someone says, well, that's great. I got a 7T magnet. So yeah, there's that aspect too, because we're human. You just like a bigger one. Like, no, I'm serious. Don't discount just being goofy humans and saying, I just want a bigger one. That's primarily how the first big ones are made. Yeah. Oh, I think by far 1.5T and 3T, fractionally, the 1.5 plus 3T probably make up 99% of the machines used clinically. And then they're at very advanced hospitals, you will have a 7T system. So these are usually in academic centers that specialize in MRI. And then to get up to here, they're just one-off kind of singular things because they're very expensive to make when they get that big, right? And they're not mass produced. But here, look at the brain here. This is cerebral spinal fluid can come out with basically a negative signal or a dark signal, or it can be very bright here. The contrast between basically the white matter tracts and the gray matter cortex can be highlighted with this weighting, so it's just very, very spectacular. And you can make an angiogram like of where the vessels are, and you can make these angiograms without injecting contrast into the patient, right? Which is in some cases a really important feature, right? And so if you're doing kids, things like that, you don't want to inject contrast in, then you have this natural contrast mechanism where spins, or it's mostly water, it's mostly protons from water, are flowing into your slice, and because they're flowing in, they're brighter, so you can, but there's many contrast mechanisms. And here's one. The group here actually at UCSD are one of the primary developers of basically spin labeling and also functional MRI. And so here you can see this is sort of a proton density kind of, well, I guess they're not, this is more like a T1 weighting here. And here, the brightness of the pixels associated in that slice are proportional to the amount of blood that has flown into that slice over a specific time, right? So if I have a bright signal right here, that means a lot of blood is flowing into that little volume, right? So that's called arterial spin labeling. This is an MR scan taken with EKG leads on the patient, and then you acquire data over multiple heartbeats, but you put that data back together depending on where the data was collected in the heart cycle. And so we'll make, say, 20 pictures, the first 20th, second 20th, third 20th of the heart cycle. So those 20 pictures might take 20 heartbeats to get them, right, to get all the data. But when you put it back together, you get this. There's a lot more information there, right, than just a static heart. So you actually can see how well the muscle is contracting at each part of the heart, right? So this is the left ventricle. It's the main pumping chamber of the heart. The blood is very, very bright. It could be for two reasons. One, either there's contrast in there, but likely it's just because the blood is coming from somewhere else and it flows into that slice and it hasn't seen previous RF pulses, and so it just shows up as really bright. So there's this dynamics creating this contrast between the blood and the tissue, right? And you can, in MR, because you have these magnetic field gradients, you can angle those gradients at any orientation you want. And so of particular interest for the heart is when you can see both the left ventricle, the right atrium, and the left atrium simultaneously. And if you look at that and you're a cardiologist, you immediately can determine whether or not this heart is beating normally, right? And here's just an example of functional MR where over the course of time, you take images of a slice of a patient's brain, right? And then while you're making those pictures, let's say we make a picture once per half second, or something like that. So we have a sequence of these pictures coming out. And now a simple experiment is I put goggles on the patient and I'll flash some stimulus, some visual stimulus, and then turn it off, and then turn it back on, and then turn it off. And then you look at what signal correlates with that stimulus. In that movie of pictures you've got, you say, well, is there any pixel in here that is really correlated with my stimulus on, stimulus off? And it turns out there is. And it's, in this case, it would be parts of the visual cortex, the signal would go up because the actual blood flow to that area went up. The contrast mechanism is a little more complex we won't dwell on it right now, you might do it, but it's really changed the way, neuroscience is done, right? Because now you can do all of these experiments on humans and, they're non-invasive and you can see these fantastic maps. And so that's a pretty cool thing. This, I don't know, it was like in the late 80s, I think was the first observation of this occurring. And it's basically taken over neuroscience now. The other thing you can do is you can take MRI pictures whose brightness is actually proportional to the amount of diffusion that has occurred in the water that's inside that voxel. And so a voxel contains many, many cells of a patient, right? Because a voxel is usually 1 millimeter per side, something like that. So inside there, you got a bunch of cells. But if they're all aligned in one direction, like a celery or something, and in the brain, it turns out certain parts of your brain, all the cells are aligned. They're all traveling in the same direction. So the diffusion of the water in that direction actually is easier than in the cross direction. So you get a bigger diffusion coefficient in that direction. So when you map those directions, you get something that looks like this. You just say, okay, in each one of these voxels, I'm going to map the direction that the diffusion is largest. You put all that together and this picture pops out. You're like, oh, well, I guess we got something going on here, right? And this is basically how white matter tracks and gray matter tracks of neurons are connected in the brain. That's super cool. Okay, we'll briefly talk about image quality. Okay, and so this is CT scan, MR scan, right? You can see with this scan, this is called positron emission tomography. We're not going to cover that in this class, but the principal difference between this one and this one is the spatial resolution, right? And everybody can appreciate, that this picture looks blurry, right? And one of my favorite comments by a physician when we were early days of doing cardiac scanning for looking at infarcts and things like that. So we do this experiment, and the data comes up, and the cardiologist goes, "Oh man, that looks great. Can you just sharpen it up a little bit?" Right? And I'm like, yes, we can, but there's a lot of trade-offs to get there. And so, describing what the spatial resolution is in an image, like what quantifies the spatial resolution, and when we're changing variables to try and get better spatial resolution per unit time or per unit dose or something like that, we'd like to be able to quantify it, right? And so we're going to learn how to do that. In addition, these are some of the big concepts that by the end of this class, we hope become second nature to you, okay, that you don't even think about it. So like when we talk about noise, you know what that means, right? And everybody knows what it means from personal experience in life. If you're listening to a signal, which is somebody talking on the phone, and there's a lot of interfering random signal, like a hiss, then that's a high noise level, and the signal itself is embedded in that noise level, so the signal to noise ratio is low. If on the other hand, the person has a fantastic mic and the signal is really clear and there's no noise, then the signal to noise is high. And usually you perceive this in factors of 10, right? So you usually use decibels because our ability to see things is logarithmic, like brightnesses are basically logarithmic, as is hearing, right? And so we'll look at how you characterize noise and how you characterize a signal to noise. In imaging, oftentimes the thing that's most important is contrast to noise. And if you have a really simple detection task that you want to do, like I need to detect infiltrating duct carcinoma in this mammogram, right? That's my goal. That's what I want to detect. And so you know the features that to look for on the picture, right? And then can you, in your image, describe the contrast between infiltrating duct carcinoma, normal fibrous breast, and the noise that's on there, right? And so can you quantify what that signal difference to noise is, right? An even simpler task would be in CT scanning, very low dose CT in smokers, it turns out if you do low dose CT in smokers and you look for small lesions in their lungs, right? You can detect ahead of time whether or not that person is going to develop cancer with higher probability than using any other technique. This is called screening. You take people that you don't know if they have cancer, right? They're normal other than the fact that they're smokers. And then you look for these spots in their lungs, right? Ideally, you look at the spot, you measure the signal intensity, you look at the background, measure that intensity and say, what's the difference between that divided by the noise, right? And is that a significant signal, that patch? Is it significantly brighter than the background? And so a lot of it depends on application, right? You know, what is your signal that you're trying to measure? Spatial resolution we'll talk about, and temporal resolution. They're just as they sound, right? Temporal resolution means you're getting signals at a higher temporal rate. I'm getting 50 frames a second instead of 20 frames a second, right? And spatial resolution will learn how to basically quantify it using Fourier methods and direct method. I'm going to do the direct method first, which is, this. Because I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to stop here and say, if I could measure in my imaging device, in an MR scanner, if I had a tiny little vitamin E tablet, you know, a little tiny thing, and put it in an MR scanner and took a picture of it. Or on a CT scanner, what we do is we take ballpoint pens and we break them, and we take the ballpoint out of the ballpoint pen, and we put it in the CT scanner, and we take a picture of it. That ballpoint, if it's on a really, you know, fine pen, is smaller than the voxel that we're imaging, right? And so it is effectively a delta function. It's effectively a point source. And we ask the question, what does the image look like of the point source, right? If I decreased the diameter of that thing by a factor of 2, the image would not change, other than it would get dimmer, right? Because it's so much smaller than the signal that the scanner produces. So this thing that the scanner produces when I put in a tiny little object is called the point spread function. That's if you have a point source, what does the picture look like? So the point spread function often is characterized by its width, right, in millimeters. You know, so it's full width at half max. So I go, here's the maximum, half max, what's that width? And one method or one notion of resolution is how close together can 2 point sources move such that I can determine its 2 sources, right? When they get close enough, it just looks like one thing, right? And then that distance, you can say, that's called the Rayleigh distance, and that's your spatial resolution, is that distance. That's one definition of spatial resolution. We'll go into many more. Okay, so I'm going to quit there. If you have